Have you been blessed? So our Torah portion, Devarim, begins in Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 1. These are the words, Devarim, which Moses spoke to all of Israel on this side of the Jordan in the wilderness in the plain opposite Suf, between Paran, Tophel, Levan, Hazeroth, and Dizahath. It is 11 days' journey from Horeb by way of Mount Seir to Kadesh Barnea. So this portion begins the final book of the Torah. These words were spoken just as the people were preparing to enter the land of Canaan. And I know that most of us are familiar with the Hebrew terms, but just in case there are some people who don't know what Devarim is talking about, this is talking about the book that most of us grew up learning as the book of Deuteronomy, which is a Greek term that just means second law. But these are the words that Moses spoke to the children of Israel as they are preparing to enter, Devarim. And so it is understood to be in some sense a Mishnah Torah, or a repetition, or maybe even better, a review of the Torah. It's primarily Moses retelling the story of the children of Israel from the time they left Egypt until just before they crossed the Jordan. And so then, it seems that the Creator compelled Moses to review everything that they have gone through, everything that they had learned, everything they had been taught, to review all of these things and to remind them the importance of keeping the commands that God had given to them. And so in a sense, these are Moses' final words to the children of Israel. And I would suggest that when you have someone such as Moses or a leader, and they realize that their time and their part of this journey is coming to a close, those things that they're going to speak to people are not going to be superfluous. They're not just going to be flippant words. They're going to be very important words, might even be a little bit more direct than they have been in times past. And so then, Devarim is more than just a review. It's Moses reiterating these things that need to be internalized, not just up here, but these things need to be in our heart. And it was going to be important that they go back through these things as they prepared to enter the land. In one respect, because they're no longer going to have the teacher that they've had. They're no longer going to have his constant presence among them every day as before. And so as they go into the land, they're going to need faith that maybe they haven't called upon. They're going to need discipline that maybe they haven't given too much attention to. And they're going to have to do this because there are going to be temptations in the land. There are going to be obstacles in the land. There are going to be giants. The same giants that their fathers would not go face are still there, and they're going to have to go face them. The same fortified cities that their fathers shied away from are still there. They're still going to have to be overcome. And so these instructions given them weren't just to be in their minds, they were to be in their hearts. It was to be internalized. It was to be part of them. And so in the land, maybe even more so than in the wilderness, they're going to have to put these things into practice. And so it kind of reminds me of years ago when, well, some of you are still in school, I realize, but there's a lot of people here who've almost forgotten what it was like to be in school. If I think really hard about it, I can remember certain things. Sometimes it was a trip to the principal's office. My favorite part of school was recess. You get to run, jump, and shout. You know, I guess that's why I went to a Pentecostal church. But anyhow, but there were times before a test was coming, the teacher would sit down and review things with us, because the test was coming. It was inevitable. And because the teacher wanted the students to do well, he or she would sit us down and say, all right, we're going to review these things. And I can remember, I'm like, oh, how many times you're going to tell us this? But it was important because that teacher wanted us to succeed, wanted to make sure that the material was covered. And so I believe that in a way, that's what was going on here, because Moses knew that they were going to be tested. So as important as it was to review the Torah, it was just as important that they knew they were going to have to act upon what they had learned. In other words, the time for sitting and the time for learning was drawing to a close. The time to take the test, the time to act the time to do, the time to walk it out, the time to make it happen, that was upon them. That's what going into the land was going to be all about. They were going to have to walk these things out in the land of promise. And so in verse 6, the Lord our God spoke to us in Horeb, saying, you have dwelt long enough at this mountain. Turn and take your journey and go to the mountain of the Amorites, to all the neighboring places in the plain, in the mountains and in the lowland, in the south and on the seacoast, to the land of the Canaanites and to Lebanon, as far as the great river, the river Euphrates. See, I have set the land before you. Go in and possess the land which the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give to them and their descendants after them. That was the reason that they needed to review these things. That's the reason these things need to be internalized, because now the time has come for you to do what I've called you to do. Everybody here understands that there is a time for every season, right? Everything has a season. There's a time for every purpose under heaven. Every season in life has a reason for our life. There is a time that things have to be broken down. And when you're in the season of breaking things down, that's what we're supposed to do. But then there is a season when things are to be built up. And when it's time to build things up, it's not time to break things down. There's an assigned season to plant things. And there is an assigned season to pluck up things that have been planted. And again, when the season calls for plucking things up, it's not the time to plant. And when it's time to plant, it's not the time to pluck things up. And then in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 5, I think it's verse 5, Solomon says there is a time to scatter stones, and then there is a time to gather stones. And I won't go too far off into this, but those stones are representative of the people. In other words, when the stones of the first temple and then the second temple, remember Yeshua told his disciples of that second house, not one stone would be left upon another. As the stones are scattered, so were the people. And so there was a season that it was the Father's purpose and will to break down that house, to scatter those stones, and as he scattered those stones, to scatter his people. But I do not believe that we are any longer in the season of scattering stones. I believe that we have well into the season where he is gathering. And so a very important principle here. If our Father's will and heart right now is to gather his people, and where is he going to gather them to if there's no place for them to gather? The responsibility falls on us. If we understand that this is a season for gathering his people, we don't need to be scattering his people. We don't need to work against the whole concept of being gathered. We don't need to be a maverick. I'm going to do this on my own. I don't have to listen to anybody. Nobody can tell me anything. Those are the people, and that is the mindset that in days, months, maybe years ahead, they run the risk of getting clipped off and pruned. How many of you are old enough to remember Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom? You remember that? Come on Sunday night. Love to watch it. But my mother loved for me to be in church too, so I didn't get to see it all the time. But, if you remember that, Marlon Perkins and Jim Fowler, they would go out to Africa somewhere, and they would be, tracing or tracking lions or something. And they would show video of how a lioness would hunt. You remember? She'd crouch in the tall grass, and she'd keep her eyes on the gazelle that got away from the rest of the herd. The maverick, if you will, the lone wolf, the one who doesn't need to be part of an assembly. That's the one she focused on. That's a dead gazelle right there. And our adversary goes about as a roaring lion. And what is he doing? He's seeking who he can devour. And I almost guarantee you the first on his target list are the people who are out there cut off, who are working against the whole idea of being assembled. I'm not talking about people who have no choice. Not talking about you folks who are on the live stream that there's nothing there for you. But I'm talking about, you know what I'm talking about. Those days are coming to an end because the scattering part, I believe, has is closed. And now we are in the season where he is gathering. That's what he's doing here. That's the call that's going out from this meeting, that he's gathering. He's calling people to assemble together. If you're going to be in an army, we prophesied this morning, raise up an army. I don't think he's raising up any Rambos. Some of you were Church of God, didn't go to movies, you don't know what I'm talking about. Anyway. He's not raising up a one-man army. He is raising up an army, a mighty army of people who are gathering together because they hear that call. They're answering it. And so the time to build up has come. The time to plant has come. The time to gather stones, gather people has come upon us. And it's very important that we discern the season we're in. So again, if he is gathering, we shouldn't be scattering. On that note, I feel very strongly to say this, and I say it with all due respect to those who've spent many, many years, decades, going around the country, going around the world teaching. The Father raised up these men and women to do this. Many of them are here with us right now. But yet I feel in my heart very strongly that the days when we as an awakening, a movement, a people, where we just sat around and waited for the next teacher to come into town to get fed, those days are coming to a close if they have not already been finished now. That is not to say that teachers aren't going to still go out. What I'm saying, though, is the emphasis that over the last couple of decades was placed on, we get together and have special meetings, rent a hotel room for Eddie to come to town so we can get fed that way, and then we wait until the next one comes, and then we wait till the next one comes. I just feel like the emphasis that was placed on that in this movement has come to an end. Now, that is no disrespect intended to any of those people. Remember, I used to be one of those people. But I feel very strongly in my heart, I'm not disparaging that. I'm just seeing that the emphasis now is going to be placed on building up communities. And so then if the winds of change are blowing, that it is incumbent upon us to adjust our sails. Well, we don't have a community in our area. Well, maybe you need to pray about that. If you're taking note of the fact that we don't have a community, I wish we had a community, maybe you need to pray about that. Oh, I could never do that. I'm scared. There are giants in fortified cities. Do not fear them. Do not dread them. Don't be discouraged or dismayed. I, the Lord your God, I go before you. Maybe you need to be praying about that. Because you see, what we read here in our Torah portion is we've been at this mountain long enough. He gave us a time where he sat us down and he taught us. He gave us teachers and they instructed us and they illuminated the word for us. They helped us to understand some things. And we would sit there and we go, wow, I never knew that. Oh my gosh, I had that all figured wrong. Wow, isn't that very interesting? We got really excited about all that. And we went out to share and that next person went, wow, I've never heard that before. And some people looked at you like you had three heads. I know. But there were, we remember this. We were excited about all these things. We need to remain excited about these things. It's just that now we need to put some legs on those things and start walking it out in all of our communities. Because you see, it is time to go to the land, so to speak, which is akin to purpose. It's time for us to function in our purpose. Coming out of Egypt did not define Israel's purpose. Now, that was something that was very important. It had to happen. And being in Egypt for that season had a reason for it. It served the Father's purpose. But it was not his purpose that they were to always remain in Egypt. If that had happened, they would have died and disappeared as a nation. So he had to call them out. That had to happen. But it did not define their purpose. Passing through the sea, eating manna every day in the wilderness. That was the Father's provision as he was pulling them out, drawing them out, calling them out from where they had been. He took care of their needs. He didn't ask them to do something and then not give them the things that they needed to do it. But going through the sea, eating manna. In and of itself, that did not define their purpose. Even the events at Mount Sinai did not exclusively define their purpose. That was a very important season for them to learn these things, to hear the call to be a nation, a kingdom of priests, these things that were presented to them. But exclusively, that didn't define their purpose either. All the things that happened, all the events that they experienced, all the stations that they went and camped at, all of those things were a season for a reason. But their purpose lay ahead for them in the land of Canaan. In other words, he didn't call them out of Egypt just to wander around for the rest of their lives. He called them out of Egypt so ultimately they would go to the land that he had sworn to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob. He caused them to pass through the sea with the idea that eventually they're going to find their way into the land of Canaan and cross the Jordan. He called them to Sinai to give them instructions and help them rid themselves and purge themselves of all the things that pertain to Egypt before they went into the land. But it was still intended that they were going to go into the land because the land represented their purpose, functioning in their purpose. We were born again for a reason. That had to happen. And we have been instructed. We've been called out of Babylon, so to speak, or called out of Egypt, however you'd like to look at it. And along the way, he's been teaching us. He sat us down at the foot of Mount Sinai, in a manner of speaking, to teach us. We were students. But it was not his purpose that we were to remain students at the foot of Mount Sinai for all time. I'm one of those people that when I get into a comfort zone, something that it comes natural to me, or I acclimate to it, and I get comfortable with it, I don't like for things to change that. I know that maybe I'm the only one who's that way, but I don't like change too much. And so many years ago when I started feeling like this running around all over the place teaching, I feel like it's coming to a close. I have to tell you, I didn't really like that feeling. And as doors began to close and I began to realize what it was that Beth and I were supposed to do in terms of leading a congregation, I will tell you, I really did not like those prospects. I said years before, I would never do that. No, I'm not doing that. I'm not doing that. I'm not doing that. And then he said, you're going to do that. I didn't like it. I went in kicking and screaming. But my point here is, everything that I had gone through, everything that Beth and I as a family had gone through, all the things that we did, all the things that did serve a purpose for a certain season, were always leading us to this place. I didn't know that at the beginning. Didn't even think about that at the beginning. Thought it was impossible. Because I just really don't like people that much. I know that you're shocked for somebody to say something like that. But most of you don't like people either. You know it. However, if the Spirit of God is present in our lives, we care for people. We can have compassion for people. Because that's what our Father's heart is. Anyway, all of those things that happened to me and all the things that have happened to you and all the experiences that you had and all the seasons in your life, you know what? All of those things had a purpose, had a reason, but ultimately it was bringing us all to this place. It's time to gather. It's time to assemble. Not just to get together with people who think like we do or talk like we do and dress like we do. Not just to get together with people to do the Shabbat with and do the Moedim with. Yeah, that's part of it, and that's a wonderful part of it. But it's not just that. You see, we're assembling because he is raising up an army. Because there's some place that we got to go to, and we got to take it away from our adversary. There are captives that need to be liberated. There are people in bondage who need to be set free. And so we need to be assembling so that the call that has come to us, that he has us in a place where he can give us our marching orders to go and do the things that he's called us to do. And we have this promise that if we're standing on that foundation stone, that Yeshua is the Mashiach and the Son of the living God, as we go forward against culture and society and the adversary and the kingdom of darkness, as we advance against that darkness, we have this promise that not even the gates of hell are going to be able to stand against us, because he's going to go before us. He's going to fight this battle. He just wants us to follow along and show that we actually do trust you. We really do believe you. We have confidence in you. Anyway, getting a little preachy. All right, I will. Now, I'm going to choose my words very carefully here, but I do want to make a point. Do we understand why there was a sanctuary? Do we know why there was a tabernacle? Do we know why there was a temple? So that God could dwell among us. And all the intricate plans and bars and beams and screens and gold and silver and bronze and all of those different things, all very important for us to understand. There are things that are taught in all of those implements. But do you know why he established a sanctuary in the midst of his people? It's so that he could dwell with us. So that he could, shanti, literally dwell inside of us. That was his purpose from the very beginning. And that we could commune with him as he communes with us. And as we commune with him, that we would commune with one another in the unity of the faith. That's the reason there was a sanctuary. That was the purpose of it all. In other words, the sanctuary and what it represented and what it attained for the community was actually the central feature in that community. And then with his presence in our midst, and we're dwelling in unity, and we are living lives that are conducive to him remaining in our midst, that would be a light to all the other nations. It would resonate outward from the community to be an example to all the other nations. And so with all due respect, I'm just using the tabernacle as an example. Let's not become so fascinated with the intricacies of the tabernacle that we forget its purpose. Its purpose was his indwelling presence, living among his people, living in our lives individually and corporately. And so all these things that we've learned are wonderful. They're beautiful. The depths of the word, it blows my mind. But let's never become so fascinated with the minutiae and the intricacies of what he said that we forget why he said it. And the purpose it was to serve, to transform our lives, and so that we would be an example. Kind of going back to what I was talking about last night. In fact, this is kind of part 2 of what I was talking about last night. To not be so focused on being different that we forget that we're supposed to make a difference. Let's not be immobilized by always learning, but never acting. And what truly makes us different, ladies and gentlemen, is, I said last night, it's not all the outward stuff, all the things that we have learned about. All those things are important, but the most important thing about all this is his presence. That we're living a life that pleases him so that he will be comfortable in our midst. We don't do certain things and we don't abstain from certain things just to say to the world, I'm different from you. We do and don't based on what he said because we want his presence in our lives. We want his spirit in this temple. We want his presence to be here. If he's raising up an army of worshipers, they must be true worshipers. And true worshipers worship how? In spirit and in truth. Now, I grew up in an environment, it was heavy on spirit. Pentecostal, tongue-talking, oil slathering, forehead slapping, running the aisle, shouting bobby pins out of your hair. I didn't wear bobby pins. The ladies did that. Do they even make those anymore? Anyway, That's how I grew up, heavy on the Spirit. Some of you know what I'm talking about. Where are all you Pentecostals at? Let me see your hands. Don't be afraid. Okay. All the Baptists are afraid now. There's so many of you. I grew up in an environment that was heavy on the Spirit. And then I got involved with whatever this is we are. And it was really heavy on the truth. Really heavy on the truth. And I'm sorry, but for me, it got so heavy on the truth that we lost sight of the balancing factor, and that was the Spirit. And so I believe all that served a purpose for me to be in that tongue-talking church. Served a purpose. Maybe you can't see it, but I do. It served a purpose for me to get all entrenched in all learning all these things, and I'd never been taught. That served a purpose. But see what's happening now, at least in my life, and this is what's happening, I believe, in Jacob's tent. He's bringing it back to a centered, more balanced position, that it's Spirit and truth. Yeah, go ahead. You see, if Messiah visibly walked into this room right now, I guarantee you we'd be living holy lives. We'd be thinking holy thoughts. We'd be speaking holy words, right? But the reality is, he said, we got more than two or more here. And if we are gathered in his name, he has said that he is going to be there in the midst of his people. And so we understand that his presence is with us. And so then, if his presence is with us, we need to be living holy lives. We need to be thinking holy thoughts. Our words, our deeds, our actions need to be a reflection of what his word tells us to do. Because you see, if his presence is here, we will be different. And if his presence is with us, we will make a difference. So again, springboarding off of what I discussed last night, I spent all those years traveling around and seeing good and not so good. I saw people who were hungry to grow, to learn, to just digest his word. But I noticed over time that some of those people dropped off because they felt like, I just feel like I've come out of one ditch and into another. And I realized what was missing in some of these congregations, not all, is they had kind of put the Spirit of God, which is the Spirit of truth, kind of shoved him to the back corner. And so no wonder we had division, factions, strife, arguing, debating, and over the silliest of things. I don't have to recount all that to you. If you've been around for any length of time, you know that this is what happened. So that's one of the reasons I started backing out of doing conferences and going around. And I have to say, including this one, it was just kind of across the board. I'm kind of backing out of these things because I need to understand what this is all about. I need some clarification here. And that's why I eventually left the road altogether. Because it seemed to me, and I'm speaking in general terms here, there are many exceptions that are represented in this room. But generally speaking, it seemed to me that we were starting to move in reverse and not forward. And so it just finally occurred to me that just having the knowledge of all these things was not enough to get the job done. And so I have wondered many times in that experience or those experiences, if in some ways we weren't some of those people who were always learning and never able to come to the knowledge of the truth. Now, I'm going to say something that you may not want to hear. You've already done that, Bill. Yeah, so. But you may not want to hear this, but I believe it's in some places it's true. I'm convinced that the reason that some have fallen off, that some that started out with us are no longer here, that some of them have gone back to church and Easter and all that kind of stuff, is because they got sick and tired of the feuding and the fighting. Amen. That may not be the reason for all of them, but I know for a fact it's the reason for many of them. They just got fed up with the feuding and the fighting over the stuff and over the discussions. They said, well, Well, why would I want to be part of this? I'm just going to go back to church. I'm just going to hunt Easter eggs and put tinsel on trees. At least everybody was kind of getting along and somewhat on the same page. And to some degree, I don't guess I can blame them for that, because you see, what they were looking for was a community. They were looking for a community. They were looking for a family. They were looking for a group of people that may not agree with everything that comes out of their mouth, but they were looking for an assembly where they could be encouraged as opposed to being continually discouraged. How many of you know what I'm talking about? Am I left out here on my own here? Okay. And so that's it. We need to be thinking about how we encourage one another. And that says to me that we got to be close to one another. We have to have a relationship with one another. We're going to have to be able to engage one another. You remember when the 10 spies came back with the report, which was accurate? There are giants in the land. There are there are cities in the land. They came back with an accurate report, but they gave an evil report. They slandered the land. And in my mind, what that connects with is this. They were undermining God's purpose for his people. They were discouraging them. That's what they said. Our brethren have discouraged our hearts. They were discouraging them from walking and functioning in their purpose. And when salt loses its saltiness and it's not going to function in its purpose, what purpose does it have at that point? It's tossed out into the street and it's trampled underfoot. What happened to those people who said, our brethren have discouraged our heart? We're not going to go in and possess the land. We're not going to do what God called us out of Egypt to do. We're not going to do the things that he's equipped us with his word to do. We're just going to stay right here. What happened to those people? They stayed right there until they died. And it was their children who went in and possessed the land. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is that the time to discourage should be over. And it is time for us to figure out how we encourage one another. Because I'm convinced that we're being called to leave the mountain, which was an all-important season in our development as a people, but we're to start making our way to the land of promise. That is, that we are to put all these things that we've learned into practice as we engage people, not to isolate ourselves from people. That is not to say that we do the things that the others do. That's not what I'm saying. It's not to say that we try to be relevant by relaxing standards, by mixing things that we know we're not to mix with. That is not what I'm saying. But Messiah had a way of going into some of the most dark places and yet still being that light without ever compromising truth. And he said, you're marveling at all these things that I've been doing. You're supposed to do greater things than this. If the Spirit that raised Messiah from the dead quickens us, we can do the things that he's called us to do. So we don't want to isolate ourselves from people. We don't want to partake of what they partake of. But he's called us to be a people who leave the mountain. You've learned enough. Now it's time to start putting these things into practice and engaging people. Learning to love God and to love our neighbor in communities. It's easy to do it when you're just reading it. Love God with all your heart. Love my neighbor as myself. Check, check, got it, done it. Go into an assembly. Get involved with a group of people week after week after week after week after month after year. Then come back and talk to me. What am I saying? It's easy to be obedient when you're just reading it from a page and you're just talking about it from time to time. But when you have to be in a group of people and learn how to be a family that functions together, you're really going to learn what it means to love my neighbor as myself. I remember, I'm going to pick on Melody for just a minute. I usually pick on Beth, but I'm going to pick on Melody for just a minute. When she was pregnant with Brielle, and she was reading all these books about how things were going to go and how she wanted to do the pregnancy and all those kinds of things. And it was going to be this way and it was going to be that way. Beth and I would just look at one another and go, mm-hmm. Because real life doesn't always read the textbook. Okay? Now here's my point. The Word of God is our textbook, and it has all the answers. But action, doing, moving, putting it into function, that's a big part of what our textbook has been telling us to do. In other words, there are things about the Word of God that we will never truly understand and realize until we start doing what it's told us to do. We won't understand certain things the way we should until we start putting these things into practice. And once again, there is no better school to learn these things than in an assembly of people who have pledged to encourage one another, to strengthen one another, to support one another, to love one another, and especially to love one another when that person is unlovable. Long suffering. You know what that means? Suffering long. If you've been married any length of time, you understand what I mean. I'm not trying to just be funny. Two lives come together to form one life. And one has a perspective, another one has a different perspective. They have this baggage and you have this baggage. And all of a sudden we're in the same place trying to figure out how to make this work. There is a lot of dying in marriage. There's a lot of sacrifice in marriage. And it's not just one who's to sacrifice and the other's on easy street. It's supposed to be that everybody is dying and suffering because that's what's happening. Your flesh is suffering through all of that because your flesh wants to rise up. Well, she did this and how come I always have to be the wrong one? And all this kind of stuff. I'm speaking from the male perspective. And of course the ladies are saying, why does he always have to be wrong? No, it's bad. But these two rough stones with hard edges, they keep rubbing one another the wrong way long enough to rub off all those hard edges until they're smooth stones fitly joined together. And the reason we stay in it to do it is because we made a pledge before God and we made a covenant with one another that I'm going to suffer long with you, because I'm going to love you through it all. But do you realize that when we came to Messiah, that we came into a covenantal agreement with him and with his body? That we're in a covenant with one another. And so, unfortunately, in this culture especially, it's so easy to take an offense inside an assembly or from a brother and just, well, I'm walking away. When in reality, what we should be doing is keep rubbing one another the wrong way long enough till all those rough edges get worn down. And you see, that's how he's going to build up this spiritual house of living stones. And that is probably not going to happen as long as you're a maverick, a lone wolf, and you're just out doing your own thing. Because he's not scattering anymore, he's gathering. The time to live as a hermit is over. It's time to live in community. And I am suggesting that, at least in part, that is what is hinted at when the Father talks about possessing the land. To come into the land as a people, as a nation, is about functioning in our purpose. And what is that function? To be a light. So as a community of faith, we're supposed to be a light to the rest of the world. You know, there are a lot of people in this world who are not of faith, but there are a lot of people in this world who want peace and they want harmony. Now, they're going about it completely wrong way. I get that. But we're supposed to be the example. We're supposed to be showing them an example of light, peace, harmony, those kinds of things. So then, my point here today is that we are the ones who have been charged in this generation to present a proper example. It was always intended, when you were first born again, it was always intended that you come into the purpose that God created you for. When God called Avram out of Babylon, he already knew then that he was going to call Abraham to the top of Mount Moriah. He had to go through a journey. He had to learn some things. But it was always intended on the moment he brought him out of Babylon that he was going to take him to Mount Moriah. And when he brought him to Mount Moriah, here's what he said. Now I know that you are someone who will not withhold anything from me. Do you know what our Father has called us to do, to give up, to die to leave behind? You know what the word is? Everything. Absolutely everything. Those who are mentioned as that remnant that they overcome the adversary. How do they do it? The blood of the Lamb, word of their testimony. And what's that third component? They love not their lives even unto death. That is what you and I have been called to. And if that is the standard to which we've been called, who are we to say, well, being in the community is just too hard? To stay in the community, oh, that's just too hard. To suffer long in that community, it's just too hard. We have been called into a covenantal relationship with him and with one another. And this is not something we can just walk away from. So I want to read just a little bit from next week's Torah portion, and I'm going to be trying to close here in just a minute. How many times have you heard me say that already this weekend? Chapter 4, verse 5. Surely I have taught you statutes and judgments, just as the Lord my God commanded me, that you should act according to them in the land which you go to possess. Therefore be careful to observe them. For this is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the peoples who will hear all these statutes and say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. For what great nation is there that has God so near to it, as the Lord our God is to us, for whatever reason we may call upon him? And what great nation is there that has such statutes and righteous judgments as are in all this law which I set before you this day? In other words, he was saying to them, if you live according to what you've been taught in the land to which the Lord your God is taking you, you are going to be blessed. You are going to prosper. You are going to be protected. And when the nations and when your neighbors and your co-workers and all these people around you see that in that when you're functioning your purpose and he is blessing you and prospering you and protecting you and healing you and everything around us is falling apart, they're going to say, who are these people? And who is their God? And he has put us in the midst of all of this chaos when everything else is breaking down and falling apart, and he's saying it's time for my people to build up. When everybody else, things are getting plucked up and industries and institutions are falling by the wayside, and everything we have come, especially as Americans, to depend on, to look to for our safety net and our security, all of those things are coming to an end. I hope you know that. It may not happen today, but it's going to happen. Hebrews chapter 12 says there's coming today, and I'm going to paraphrase, that he's going to just do this. Everything will be shaken. And the only thing that will be left standing is what is supposed to be, and what is true, and what is pure, and what is holy, and what is righteous. Everything else is going to fall and crumble. And by the way, if you continue to read in Hebrews chapter 13, he says this in verse 1, let brotherly love continue. And you know what that word brotherly love is, right? Philadelphia. Let Philadelphia continue. In other words, implying that when everything else is falling down, Philadelphia is still going to be standing. Brotherly love still going to be there. You go read about that congregation, one of the only 2 of 7 congregations that the Messiah did not rebuke and have something against. And he looks upon the congregation of Philadelphia, and again, I'll paraphrase. I know you're worn out. I see that you're tired. You've been weakened. But through all of this, you have not denied my name. You have kept my word. You have kept my command to persevere, to overcome, to press toward the mark. And because you've done that, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to cause all those people who were railing accusations at you, who hated you, who persecuted you, and who mocked you, I'm going to have them come down and bow before you, and they're going to know that I have loved you. Let me put it to you this way. All of those nations round about Israel, when they were doing what they were supposed to be doing, functioning in their purpose together as a people, not divided, all of those nations were going to know that there is a God in Israel. That's what he's saying. They will know that you are a special treasure. They will know that you are a kingdom of priests. And they'll be motivated, some of them, to learn more about the God of Israel because they see what's going on in your life. And I'm going to recommend to you that they can see it a lot easier when there's a larger group of us together and you're not just behind curtains and closed doors in your house. If it was true then, it's true now. So then, I know that ultimately this is a prophecy that speaks to the fact that one day he's going to call us all back to the land of Israel. But right now, today, we have a commission. We have a commission right now where we're at to disciple. We have a mission and responsibility to train and to raise up the next generation. By the way, I don't want these young people who were gathered here, I don't want the legacy we leave them is discouraging, fighting, feuding, division, strife. I want the legacy that we leave them is encouraging, support, hope, the future, to know that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is true to his word when people will be faithful to listen and to serve him. We also learn from this Torah portion that refusing to embrace the purpose doesn't end well. Because for fear of what God called them to do, they refused to enter the land. And as I've already mentioned, they ended up dying in the wilderness. It was their children that finished the job. So here's what I'm getting at. If you haven't figured it out already, it's time to transition from a large group of people just coming out of Egypt or out of Babylon, going in all different directions. It's time to transition from that to become one people, one community, comprised of many, all focused on the same goal, all following Messiah's example, engaging people and improving their lives. When Messiah encountered people, by the time he got through talking to them and walking away, their life was different. Their life was different, and he didn't compromise one iota. Now, sometimes people ran away. Unless you drink of my blood and eat of my body, you'll have no part of me. Well, that's just I don't understand that. I mean, what's this all about? This guy's speaking against what Moses wrote. They didn't take the time to try to understand what he was getting at. And they walked away. And you know what? He didn't chase them down either. He didn't run after them and say, hey, wait a minute, well, you just misunderstood. Come back, let me explain what I'm talking about. He didn't do that. He turned to the 12. Y'all going to leave too? What I'm getting at is he didn't compromise. He stayed steadfast. He stayed focused. And yet, at the same time, he remained compassionate, merciful, loving. He looked on people as being sheep, having no shepherd, and that broke his heart. He had compassion on them. Think about that. He had compassion on them because they were as sheep, having no shepherd. And what do we infer from that? He wanted his people to have shepherds. Shepherds, people who would lead and guide his people into truth, into the fullness of this abundant life. And so again, if we follow his example, we're going to engage people, not run away from them. They may run away from us, but we're going to engage people. And the idea is that because of the one who dwells in us, that we change their life in a positive way. And on that note, I want to ask you what Paul focused on. Paul, would you agree, was a pretty smart fellow? You think so? Everybody knows that Paul was not a New Testament scholar, right? Paul knew all these things that were in the Torah. He trained at the feet of Gamaliel. He understood all these mysteries and all these intricacies. But what was Paul focused on? 1 Corinthians chapter 2. And I, brethren, when I came to you, I did not come with excellence of speech or of wisdom, declaring to you the testimony of God. For I determined not to know anything among you except Yeshua the Messiah and him crucified. I'll paraphrase what I believe he's saying. Yeah, I could have talked about some things that would make you go, wow. I could curl your hair with some of the things that I know that are in the Torah, but that's not what I came to do. I came to focus upon Yeshua the Messiah and him crucified. I was with you in weakness and fear and in much trembling. And my speech and my preaching were not with persuasive words of human wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power. Now, when you start talking about a demonstration of the Spirit to a bunch of Messianic people, many of them start getting nervous. They do. I've watched it. We've had people come into our congregation that I am pleased to say today, they're right in the thick of it. But when they first coming in and they saw us lifting our hands and Melody's up there on the front dancing and everything, they were like, eyes were this big around. What is going on here? But what did Paul say? I came not with human wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power. Here's why. That your faith should not be in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. He doesn't want our faith to be in, and I'm going to say this respectfully, he doesn't want it to be in any teacher, any man, any person, just because they can wow you with their words. He doesn't want your faith to be based on that. He wants your faith to be based on a trust in his power, in his might, and his ability. That's where he wants our focus to be, not in the wisdom of men. And there are men going around teaching, and in every facet of the body, who want you looking at them and what I can impart to you. We need to be the kind of people who defer all attention to him, and we look to the things that he can impart to us. And so then, as we build community, let's not forget what Paul said here. Let's not forget the central feature of the community, and that is his presence. Because if he's not here, we don't have a community. There is a reason that the tabernacle of Shiloh was destroyed. There's a reason that the temple of Solomon was destroyed. There's a reason that that second temple was destroyed. And it ultimately gets down to this, because by the time it was destroyed, it was because his presence was no longer there. It was just a building. So if his presence isn't here, we don't have a community. We have a commune. And if he is here, then it is our responsibility to live holy lives like we described last night. So parents, I might go a minute or two over. I hope you'll forgive me. If, I guess you can fire me afterwards. Parents, strive to live holy lives, but demand that your children do it while they're in your home as well. I want to make certain that you caught that word I used. Not just encourage them, demand. And you know why? Because we are going to be held accountable. If our families are not strong, our ministries are not strong. If our families are not strong, then our communities are not going to be strong. And so godly order, self-discipline have to be present if we are going to enjoy his presence. And remember, without his presence, we don't have a community. With his presence, we are regarded as a holy people who can minister to him, and we can minister to others. When his presence is among us, we live in blessing, we live in favor, we live in prosperity. That doesn't mean that bad things won't happen. It just means that his presence is going to carry us through those things to his glory, and so that the people who are watching how you live in these communities will go, who are these people? Why are their lives so different? There are a lot of people in the quote-unquote Messianic world, Hebrew roots world. They'll join in on the live stream when we get together at Jacob's Tent, and sometimes they'll come and visit us in-house. And some of them think we're just way too churchy. We say words that we're not supposed to say. Sometimes we'll say the word Jesus. I know, shocker. Shocker. And it's like, Or we'll sing in a praise song and people are lifting their hands and they're just praising God, and that makes some people a little uncomfortable. And then on the other hand, there are people who say, we're just way too Jewish. What's all this Hebrew stuff? River of Life does a whole lot more Hebrew stuff than we do. But I guess this is the point I want to make as I'm starting to close. Everything I learned in church was not wrong. In fact, my time in church served a purpose. And I believe it was a good purpose. Because at the very least, I learned that men have their ideals and then God has his word. And it becomes my responsibility to differentiate between what man said and what God said. So I don't disdain that. Everything I've learned from our Jewish friends is not wrong. I've learned that they have a great respect for God's word, his Torah. I've learned they have a great respect for the customs and traditions that help us go and live by the word of God. And I have great respect for that. But I've also learned other things that I don't agree with. By and large, they still don't believe Yeshua is the Messiah. That's an issue. But my point here is everything that God brings into our life in these seasons serves a purpose. But all of them were always pushing us to this point. He's always been directing us to this point, to come into this season where he's no longer scattering, he's gathering. He's no longer plucking up necessarily, he's planting, he's building up. And so then I don't want to be like them, and I'm not trying to be like them. We need to learn to be like him in every way. And so it is our duty to present a faithful and an authentic representation of our Messiah to everyone we engage. And I realize that I'm not going to be able to do that without his Spirit. I'm not going to be able to do that without his word. To be a true worshiper, it must be in spirit and truth. One of the last things that Brad Scott and I talked about when he was at my house a couple of years ago, we talked about a lot of things, but one of the things was, he's like, you're leading a congregation? You're the last person in the world that I would think would lead a congregation. We had that discussion. But one of the things that he was concerned about was that the people in the Hebrew Roots movement had kind of given up on the role of the Spirit in our lives. He was very concerned about that. And specifically when it came to expressions of praise and worship, those weren't his exact words to me, but that was his sentiment. And if some of you recall, just a few years ago, Brad was trying to put together these events in different places where it wasn't teaching, it was music, and it was praise, and it was worship, and it was adoration, these things, because that was what was on his heart. And so if I could sum that up, it would be this, that he, I, the McClendons, HRN, the Odells, other people, and I'm going to presume everybody in this room, we realize that we need his word, we need the truth, but we need the Spirit of truth to lead and to guide us. And the Spirit of truth is saying, we've been at this mountain long enough. It's time, folks, to put these things into action, to love God with more than just our minds, but to love him with our heart, not be afraid to show it, and not be afraid to go up against any enemy that he calls us to face. That is what we are called to do, to be that shining city on a hill that cannot, should not be hidden. Amen? So, Father, we thank you. We thank you for your word. And I pray that these things that you placed upon my heart to share with your people, that now that you would impart to them your word, your message, that point, that issue that they need to hear. As Mark has said many times, Father, the word within the words, that message within the message. And I pray that, Father, you'll just encourage us to receive what you have to say to us today, not the words of man, but your word. And that those who have been dry bones, those who have felt like they were in a pit, in a grave, not going anywhere, those who are desperate to be revived, those who are desperate to be refreshed. I pray, Father, that you will breathe on them. I pray that your wind would blow across their face, and that it would just permeate every nook and cranny of their being, that you would raise them up from that pit and that grave. And that as a whole, Father, these people that you have assembled here, those who are represented in the live stream, that those people that you've imparted your word and your truth and awakened with them a greater love, understanding, and respect for your words from beginning to end, that, Father, you would also quicken us by the same Spirit that raised Messiah from the dead to go out and to be the warriors, to be the army, to be the praisers, to be the worshipers that you're calling us to be, and to be that light. These things we pray, we ask for, and we believe for, because we've come to you in the name that is above all names, the name of Yeshua, our Messiah. Amen. Amen. All right, now here's what we want to do. We're not done. It is our custom on Shabbat that we actually receive an offering. Now, I know that in years past, HRN has waited until Saturday evening to do this, but I ask permission to do it now. And so this might be taking some of you by surprise, and so, surprise. But here's what we want to do. I know that many of you have traveled a long way and gone to great expense to be here. But if you're hearing this call and you are believing that this is the season that the Father is bringing us into, and you believe that you are convinced that River of Life, Jacob's Tent, HRN, others are hearing from the Father, then I want us to show our support this morning and let us continue to help HRN help others carry that message out and advance it, that it expands. If you really believe that. If you really believe that. There's a passage in Numbers chapter 10 that we read at every Rosh Chodesh about one of the purposes of the silver trumpets. And then we blow the silver trumpets at certain times of the year, one of them at Rosh Chodesh, and we're instructed in verse 10 of chapter 10 that when the people would bring their offerings, they would sound the silver trumpets over these offerings and such. And in that passage, and I'm paraphrasing, it says, because if you do this, these things are going to be a memorial before the Lord your God. And that means this. When we do things that he says will be a memorial, that's his way of saying that as you give, as you pray, as you do righteous deeds, all these things that are just are going to start accumulating. And he's going to let them accumulate because he knows that there is going to be a day of adversity for you, and that you are going to cry out to him in desperation, and he's going to look at all of those prayers and alms and righteous deeds that have been accumulating as a memorial before him in your name, that in your day of desperation, when you cry out to him, he's going to look, and that's going to become a memorial before him. He's going to remember. It's tied to that idea. God doesn't forget things, but he remembered Noah and his family in the ark, which meant that he started acting on their behalf. And so when Cornelius, this righteous Gentile, is praying to the God of heaven, he's giving alms, he was visited, I would assume, in a very critical time in his life. And he says, these things have come up before God as a memorial. In other words, now he's going to start doing something for you. And that's how Peter ends up visiting this man's house, and how the nations first heard the gospel of the Messiah and that the kingdom is being restored. So here's what I'm getting at. We don't do these things just because it's the thing to do. We don't do it just because it takes funds to do things. Yes, that's part of it. But we believe that when we pray and we do what is right in his eyes, and when we sacrificially give to a cause and to a ministry or what have you that is actually proclaiming the truth, these things are accumulating before our Father, and one day, in your desperation, you're going to call out, and he's going to look at that memorial, and he's going to remember all these things that you've done, and especially when you've done it out of obedience and sacrificially. And you know what he's going to do? His throne is going to become his war chariot, and he is going to act on your behalf. He's going to go before you, and he's going to fight your battle. If you don't believe what I'm saying, go read the Bible. That's what it's talking about. And so I want to invite everybody that your heart is stirred in that way, who is prepared, and if you have a willing heart, I want you to present an offering to the Lord today. And we're not going to pass the bucket. You come to the bucket. You bring your offering unto the Lord. And there's a container over there, and there's a container over there. And I don't know how many people are going to respond to this. We've got a lot of people, and this is a small room with this many people. But if you have to press through to do it, so be it. Do it. The woman pressed through the crowd to grab hold of his Hitziot, because that's how desperate she was for an answer. And so you think of it this way: there's going to be a day that you're going to need an answer. There's going to be a day that you're going to be in the midst of adversity, and you're going to cry out to the Father. And when you do, you can say, hey, I've been following your word. I've been doing what you told me to do. I've been praying. I've been giving alms. I've been doing these things. I need your help. I think that is proper. So if you have a willing heart and you have prepared to do that, I want you to come now, and I want you to deposit your gift, your offering, in these containers. And I want y'all to sing that song.